Hello and welcome to Natural 2, our unscripted tabletop talk show. I'm James and he's Nathan. Thanks for watching. Nathan, what are we talking about this time?
We're finally doing our little press release of how to communicate in D&D and what that looks like, because we reference that band-aid or that approach in all of our different conversations we've had thus far
Let's talk about D&D. Let's talk about you and me.
in the topic of communication and what that looks like, how you should approach it. Is your game and your group in a healthy point of communication is probably a good question to ask. But where I think the best place to start when broaching this topic in its entirety is how you individually are approaching a conversation or feedback or a criticism, either way. If you are going to a player or you're talking to your group, I have found my place, because I will offer up that I am not the most perfect individual, believe it or not, that there have been times that I've asked for feedback from the group, and I have either taken it as a half measure or I have ignored it somewhat entirely due to other circumstances, whether it's something like, oh, they're new players, they don't know what they want, or what they're asking for doesn't make sense, or things of that nature, and then kind of taking their feedback and putting it to the side. Which, if you are attempting to really run a good D&D game, which is a matter of preference or different perspectives for most people, you should be taking your players' feedback pretty sincerely and pretty seriously and applying that to your DM style or the campaign or the story or whatever topic or issue is being discussed at that time.
I think it's also important for the players to stay in touch with each other and with the DM and try to pick up on some of those cues or be an active listener. Don't just assume that you always understand what's being said or what's going on, and certainly don't just check out when you're not being directly spoken to.
When we say, you should communicate with your group, I think some people might take that as, oh, I talk to my group all the time, but I never get, the answers I want, or they always forget things. When we say communicate with your group, that isn't just have a conversation with them or, shoot the shit with them for an hour after the session. The one thing that I always struggle with is when I am having a conversation with someone and their full attention is not on that conversation, I already kind of feel not insulted, but a little bit more disengaged than I should be. I feel like my words and my attempts to get points across are not being fully listened to, and so I'm not putting my best foot forward and trying to actively communicate. So when we say communicate with your group, set aside a dedicated time. Make sure both parties on this partnership or this dialogue are actually fully invested and it isn't someone on their phone while someone else is speaking at them. You want to have a back and forth, a dialogue, a discussion, and some progress that you can actually physically see, or not physically, but you can see a notable shift in both of your perspectives and where you're coming from.
It also means being prepared to be vulnerable and to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Communication is hard. For that reason in particular, because it's uncomfortable sometimes, it's awkward sometimes. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen so many people online looking for advice. How do I get my players to do this? How do I get my players to do that? And if you're on the same page already, then you've got room to play in those kind of subtleties. I'll just encourage or discourage this behavior that I have observed without coming out and shining a light on it or calling someone to the carpet. But if you're not only not on the same page, but not even in the same book, that approach is not going to cut it. And that's the kind of thing that a lot of people are asking about. How do I do this? How do I get my player to do that? And what they mean is, what is a trick I can use to avoid having to be honest with this person?
Mm-hmm.
My player won't stop molesting all the farm animals in my campaign. Well, there's no NPC that you're going to add to the party that
Mm-hmm.
can guide them away from that behavior. You're just going to have to talk to them about it. And it's one of the hardest leaps to make. D&D is already a pretty intimate activity. I mean, you're putting yourself out there if you're doing it with any kind of sincerity, and making that leap to just be honest with someone, and 9 times out of 10, letting them know that there's something that they are doing that you dislike. or that is being disruptive, it's hard, but there's no
Yeah.
substitute.
Yeah. I have really this campaign that I've ran with is Millionth Adventures in our group is the only serious campaign I have to pull from, and so all of my experiences on how to communicate and what went wrong and what went right comes from that. And there's only been so far one time where the communication was just so disconnected that we had to remove a player from the game, and it was a terror on me. I felt horrible. I was like nervous and anxious, and I felt like a bad person. And it's not a great feeling, but you have to realize when you've reached that point, you have to understand that it is, as the DM, your responsibility to make sure that the group and the table move forward in the right way. And a lot of people don't want to hear the advice that sometimes a certain player doesn't fit or a certain character that a player has brought doesn't fit, and you have to lay down the law in some aspects, and it sucks and there's no way around it, and you just got to deal with it, and it's not good, but it's part of the game. It's probably the worst part of the game, but it is part of the game.
It's something that I wish got more dedicated time and words and explanation, even in a dungeon master's guide. And I
Hmm.
think I've seen that people call out the fourth edition DMG as having good advice, or at least more advice about managing the table itself, the personalities, that kind of thing. But it's something that new DMs are not warned about adequately. Being the referee at your table doesn't just mean adjudicating rules questions. It also means being the host of the game and, well, keeping people happy in a sense. I
Hmm.
mean, checking in with them and trying to solve problems and being a facilitator. That is a big part of being a DM too.
The side of being a DM that I wish more people considered or felt was a more natural inclusion in the tabletop role playing sphere. Even though I am the person, referring to me as the DM that brings everyone together and sets up all the schedules and, makes the story happen the way it does, everyone else at the table is just as capable as I am of these social aspects of the game. We're all adults, unless you're playing with children, but for all intents and purposes, we're all adults here. There isn't anything stopping you from going up to another player or talking to another player out of session and being like, hey, I had this problem, or I was unsure about this, or, what did you mean when you said something like that? Instead of going to the DM like a kindergarten teacher and being like, Mrs. G, little Tommy threw sand at me, there is the option to actually speak to your fellow players and try individually to improve the game behind the scenes instead of leaving it all on the DM side. But it is kind of an uphill battle bringing that up. But I thought it's worth throwing out there if it helps one or two people to actually facilitate that.
That is a good point. That
Mhm.
it might be that the DM is sort of in charge of these aspects,
Mhm.
or might be in the best position to address it or do something about it. But don't ignore problems that you know are happening just because you're only a player.
Mhm.
There, you can absolutely volunteer to have have conversations, to get in touch with people, identify problems, bring up things that maybe your DM doesn't realize. The list goes on. The point being, you can always take an active role when it comes to the health of the group.
To bring somewhat of a conclusion to this conversation, in your perfect world, James, you being a player in X game, it doesn't have to be ours, but just a standard tabletop role playing game, something happens in the game that bothers you as a player. What is your process to solving that? What is your step by step approach to fixing that problem?
I think it depends on whether it was an action centered on an NPC, or that an NPC took, or sort of a plot point of the campaign, or whether it
Mm-hmm.
was something that another player did.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the shortest and sweetest way of dealing with it is to start out by going to that person directly. Um, whether it's the DM or the player. And outside of game, don't stop a session if you can.
Mhm.
If you can avoid it, I think it's best practice not to stop a session unless you are really uncomfortable or it's really a heinous
Mhm.
situation. Um, and I think we can guess what kinds of situations or topics those would be without having to
Mhm.
go into it. But if it's something that is just sort of in the back of your mind or just an annoyance, then you can wait till the session is over and you can approach that person ideally right after the game that night
Mhm.
and say, I just wanted to talk about this and it's kind of bothering me and I want to see if we can have a discussion about it. I think use your best judgment if it's a situation between you and another player as to whether or not to loop the DM in,
Mhm.
just because you don't want to create a situation where there's tension at the table and the DM has no idea why. And I do tend to think of the DM as sort of the MC. So if it's something that's likely to come up again in one way or another, then it's probably a good idea to let them know too.
My recommendation there is go to your DM first if you're unsure or if you're uncomfortable, and at least get their perspective on it. And you might the communication might have to stop right there, where you realize that you weren't seeing some side of it, or that you weren't understanding some of the, I don't know, more intricate details of what happened. And if that's it, then that's cool. But alternatively, the DM could say, "Yeah, this might be a problem where I understand where you're coming from. Why don't you talk to them and then, get back with me, or see how that goes." That would be kind of the half measure between going to a player by yourself and then complaining only to the DM. It's kind of riding that middle line.
I don't know if this is the best place to bring up this aspect. It's sort of the last resort. In your mental preparation for these situations, you have to include and account for the possibility that you're not going to come to a resolution. Just, just because you made the leap and were honest doesn't always mean that
Mhm.
everything's going to be kumbaya after. I think most of the time it probably will be. But even when it isn't, number one, that isn't a reason to avoid doing it. I'm sorry to say. And number two, you have to then be prepared for whatever the next step is. And it's just like any other sort of negotiation, because negotiation is just a form of communicating. You have to be prepared to walk away if you are the player, or to send someone away if you're the DM. And it's easy for me to say that. I know. There are people that have friends in their game, or there are people that don't want to be mean, or that just seems like a huge conflict that they really wanted to avoid. I understand. And I'm going to struggle with it at some point in the future too. We all are. Nobody likes doing it. Uh, or if you do, then you may want to speak to a therapist. But sometimes there's no getting around it. That has to be a part of your, well, again, your mental preparation.
I would double down and say be prepared to be wrong. Like, be prepared to go into a conversation, and wrong might not be the right term, but
Have your mind changed.
exactly. Yeah, that's the right way to place it. Whenever you think about a conversation before going into it, like let's say you have a call with someone at the end of the day, you have an idea of where it's going to go, what you're going to say, how you're going to convince them or get your point across. You should be fully prepared for them to genuinely change your mind or shift your perspective or explain something you weren't aware of and have your mind changed.
That's true too. It's not, real life conversations are not social combat. You're not trying to win.
I'm
You're
rolling
trying to,
persuasion.
yeah. You're not trying to win. You're trying to, communication in game would be a whole other video. You're not trying to win. You're trying to make the game better and to keep things running smoothly. And sometimes that means being a big boy or a big girl and having the conversation that you don't want to have.
That kind of wraps into my final piece of advice that I would give for this conversation, specifically looking at DMs, but this could also apply to players as well. Problems that aren't addressed and that you just let linger in the background aren't going anywhere. You got to address them. Nothing in the game is going to change it. There isn't some divine moment where everything comes together and the problem goes away. If you don't address it, it's going to stay there. And if it stays there too long, it's going to burn you out. It's going to get you bitter. It's going to get you resentful, ruin your enthusiasm, and drag the game down. And that is the cornerstone of this conversation is communication is there to keep the game going. And if you don't use it, the game will not continue.
Pain and suffering of having to push past your reluctance to have an uncomfortable conversation or direct conversation is almost always going to be less than the pain and suffering of trying to brute force your way through a campaign, either as a player or a DM, especially as a DM, that has this recurring chronic issue. That guy is not going to stop molesting farm animals on his own. I'm here to tell you, he's going to keep doing it. That's going to hurt more over time. Especially if it causes the game to end, the group to break up, what have you. It is easier to deal with it directly with clear eyes. Trust us.
We occasionally know what we're doing.
It's one of the realms in D&D and in life where I can say I've been there, and I've done it wrong 100 times, 1,000 times.
I'm still doing it wrong today.
It's yeah, and I'll do. And you know what? Nobody's perfect. It's very hard. It's very hard. Forgive yourself. Don't be frustrated with yourself either. It's one of the hardest things a human being can do. When people go to counseling, communication is something that they cover and cover and cover. It's not easy. It's going to make your life easier.
Yeah, that is the way that you get through it is you hold on that little seed of hope that once you get through this bad time, once you get through the slog, it is greener on the other side.
We have we done it? Have we?
I think so. I was trying to keep it rather condensed. I don't think we went on any too large rambling. I think all of our advice and information was pretty on point. So,
Pretty good about it. We successfully talked about talking. And speaking of communication, communicate with us in the comments.
yeah, there you go.
Things that you want us to talk about in the future, things that you feel like we got right or wrong in this recording.
Mm-hmm.
We want to see it. And while you're down there, there's other buttons you could press too. Just
Mm-hmm.
FYI. I'm being direct and honest with you. I want you to subscribe and like.
A little bit of engagement will go a long way. I certainly enjoy seeing any sort of comments that pop up. Also, check out our Ismillionth Adventures, our long-term D&D campaign that we run if you want to see if all of our advice actually turns into something of a finished product that is worth playing. But that's all that I have today, sir.
Me as well. Thanks for watching, and come back for the next one.